Hello everyone, and welcome to this presentation from wherever you are in the world. My name is Mark Hall, and I work as a collections officer at Perth Museum, mainly responsible for the archaeology collections. I'm the curatorial lead for the project, joined recently by conservator Anna Swagaman, who has been helping with preparations for the new museum project in Perth. This presentation summarises the results to date, October 2020, of Perth Museum's ongoing conservation and research of its ancient Egyptian mummy and its current coffin or sarcophagus, made for a female mummy named Takareb. We will look briefly in turn at the results from the imaging of the mummy in 2012, the 2020 phase of conservation and display, and its future objectives. The mummy and sarcophagus have been in Perth since the 1930s, but have been in Scotland since the 1890s, having been originally acquired by the Alloa Society of Natural Science and Archaeology. One of the Society's minute books records, on the 1st of April 1896, Mr. William Bailey, senior magistrate and owner of Alloa Pottery, presented the Museum of Alloa with an Egyptian mummy in coffin, 2,800 years old, purchased by the donor from the curator of the Government Museum at Cairo. A glass case was also presented for the preservation of the exhibit. In the 1930s, the Society decided it could no longer maintain a museum and gave away many of its collections to museums willing to take them. In 1936, Perth Museum was offered and agreed to take the mummy. It became then part of a modest collection of Egyptian antiquities that has always been popular in Perth. The range of items included elements of canopic jars, some shown upper left in this slide, a range of shabtis, 3 of them shown upper right here, a range of amulets, including the all-seeing eye of Horus, shown mid-upper here, a range of genuine and fake scarab amulets and amulets, 2 of them lower left here, connected with other creatures, including the hare shown in the middle of this slide, and also fragments of tomb hieroglyphics. The example shown here, bottom right, comes from a tomb in Thebes and is dated to around 1500 to 1000 BC. The Perth collections also include other examples of mummification, namely 4 mummified hands and a mummified ibis. It was through these items that the museum was to link up with Manchester University and find out more about our mummy. Around 2008, Manchester University began a project looking at the whole question of animal mummification, and this included setting up a biobank, a database of tissue samples from animal and bird mummies. We were invited to include ours, which we were more than willing to do, of course, not least because it meant our items could be x-rayed and CT scanned, usually a very expensive process. This example is a mummified ibis, the ibis being the bird of Thoth. It may have been found at Saqqara and was clearly repackaged in the 19th century for sale as a tourist souvenir. The analysis of the ibis bundle revealed no material in good enough condition to confirm the ibis identification proclaimed on the wrapping. There are lots of small bones and feather elements combined with mud, suggesting that this was using up leftover bits from other mummifications and perhaps swept off the workshop floor. Before we meet the Perth mummy, we should just acknowledge one less ancient Egyptian object in the Perth collections, this fiberglass copy of a sarcophagus crudely based on that of the pharaoh Tutankhamun, which has been in the collections of Perth Museum since the mid-1960s. Bottom right, we see it on display in the window of McEwan's department store in Perth in the 1960s, helping to sell their Egyptian-themed cotton print dresses and skirts. Before this, we think it stood outside one of the cinemas in Perth. It is actually one of the props made for the 1959 Hammer House of Horror film, The Mummy, starring Christopher Lee. In 2012, what was to become phase 1 of our mummy project followed on serendipitously from the analysis of the other tissue samples for the biobank project. Thus began the realization of the museum's long-term aim to have the mummy conserved and a new case made for her so that she could be displayed more often. This involved taking the mummy down to Manchester for CT scans and X-rays. The work was carried out late one evening over 3 or 4 hours with the generous support of the staff and equipment at the NHS Royal Children's Hospital, also part of the university. This then was the beginning to the seeking of answers to a number of research questions laid out in this slide and around iconographic analysis, if you like, the designs on the sarcophagus, microscopic analysis, and radiographic analysis. Initial visual inspection, here by Lydia McKnight and Campbell Price of the university, showed that the sarcophagus comprised a matching coffin lid and base with some slight damage to the foot of the coffin base. There was a layer of detritus which appeared on inspection to be a hardened, sandy matrix. The registers of hieroglyphs and the painted iconography are visible at the outlying areas of this matrix, implying that this layer lies over further intact decoration. Photos of the coffin were taken to the First Vatican Coffin Conference in June 2013 and shown to coffin experts. The general consensus was that the coffin could be dated to the 25th dynasty and that it probably originates from the region of Akhmim in Middle Egypt. Digital radiography, or DR, revealed details about the construction of the wooden coffin, including the separate application of the hands and their joint construction, both unusual features for this kind of coffin. Both DR and CT revealed that the body was that of a single individual wrapped within the mummy bundle. The head and legs appeared well preserved, but the body had suffered extreme disruption to the thorax and pelvis, causing a loss of skeletal integrity in these areas. The damage to the body has made determining the sex biologically impossible. The working assumption is that if she is the original incumbent, then she is female based on the coffin iconography. Dental examination revealed the loss of the back teeth on the upper jaw as a result of root infection. The surviving teeth on the lower jaw show heavy wear caused by a fibrous diet contaminated by inorganic particles such as sand. Diet was also responsible for the loss of many of the upper teeth. It caused the thickened ridge of bone, which contains the teeth sockets, the so-called alveolar bone, to recede around many of the teeth, causing them to loosen and eventually fall out before the bone healed. The embalming process appears to have displaced some of the teeth and made the lower jaw protrude. Certainty is difficult because the jaw joint is obscured by embalming materials. The best estimation that could be arrived at for her age at death is that she was over the age of 30, based on dental eruption and the state of tooth wear and the alveolar recession. The damage to the rest of the skeleton meant that any further age markers had also been destroyed. So turning to the mummification technique revealed by the imagery, it suggests that transnasal exacerbation via the ethmoid sinus took place. In other words, a hooked implement was inserted up the nose and the brain matter removed with that implement via the nose. The sphenoid sinus remained intact. Packing had been placed within the orbital sockets, and those eye sockets are still intact. The legs had been individually wrapped in linen before the final stage of linen was used to wrap both limbs together. The arms had also been wrapped individually before being crossed over the chest with the hands on the opposing shoulders. The tongue appears to be in situ, and there is no evidence for packing within the mouth or throat. The severity of the destruction of the thorax has obliterated any evidence of evisceration and packing. Bizarrely, the bones are in roughly the right position, however, they are all severely disrupted. It is suspected that the body was well preserved, but that an event, post-desiccation or post-mummification, has caused extreme trauma to the skeleton and desiccated soft tissue. There are areas where the skeletal elements appear to lie adjacent and joined to the wrappings, which appear to have flexed with the impact. The cervical spine has been severed at the second thoracic vertebra. The spine appears to be intact from C1 to the upper borders of T2. 3 thoracic vertebrae appear to have become dislodged. It looks as if an attempt may have been made to lift the mummy bundle from the coffin at both the head and the feet ends simultaneously. Both may initially have moved, but the thorax and pelvis seem to have remained affixed to the coffin base and remained there when the body flexed, causing disruption. The blue dotted lines represent the planes of maximum flex, and the red lines show the subsequent planes of fracture or disruption of the body. Investigation of the coffin design and its hieroglyphs indicated that it was made for a female of the 25th or 26th dynasty of ancient Egypt. This gives a date of approximately 760 BC to 525 BC. The female design traits include the hairstyles and the serpents painted on either side of the lower half of the coffin. Stylistic investigation suggests that the coffin was probably made in the provincial town of Akhmim. The mix of design elements painted on the coffin reflects the provincial practice of selecting design elements that suited a customer's taste or that they had seen in use elsewhere and found aesthetically pleasing. Akhmim was a regular stopping point on the river in later times for travellers and tourists, a good place for people to purchase antiquities, both by collectors and museum staff. There were many supervised excavations there towards the end of the 19th century, and it may be that our mummy originated from one of those. Various iconographic elements were noted, including the use of the serpent motif, which is thought by some to be typical of female coffins. As a symbol, the snake is ambiguous and could mean good or bad. Shown swallowing its own tail, it symbolized totality and life, including rebirth. But the snake could also symbolize death, and the evil god Apep took the form of a snake. Deployed on a coffin, it was probably meant to be protective. As one might expect on a coffin, there is a thread of afterlife or underworld imagery. The collar area depicts the goddess Mat, whose main role in the underworld was to weigh the incoming soul against a feather. The mid side shows the jackal-headed god Anubis, who was closely linked to mummification as the god of embalming and the dead. Since jackals were seen in cemeteries, the Egyptians believed Anubis watched over the dead. Just above Anubis, we can see the symbol for the West, a euphemism for the land of the dead, or the netherworld. The West is where the sun sets and was thought to descend to the netherworld, or Duat. Turning to the hieroglyphic inscription, this comprises 5 vertical columns on the lower torso of the coffin lid. It is of a standard format and includes prayer formulas, 2 of which are shown here. In the 4th column from the left, it also includes the name Taka Reb, which is a female name. At the time this first phase of analysis took place, a full reading of the inscription was prevented by the layers of ingrained dirt shown here on the right. The second phase of work has just taken place with the conservation of the coffin and the body, work carried out as the centrepiece of an exhibition about conservation held at Perth Museum and entitled Conservation in Action, Saving the Perth Mummy, which opened in late 2019 and ran through to the unanticipated COVID-19 lockdown at the end of March 2020. Let's stick for now with the coffin design before looking at other aspects. On the right, you can see the newly cleansed area of the hieroglyphic panels. We are in the process of refining the translation of these, once again through the good offices of Campbell Price, but this aspect has been forestalled by COVID-19, so I have nothing further to report as yet. We are hopeful that it may include details of Takareb's lineage, her parents. We mentioned earlier the depiction of the West symbol, euphemism for the underworld. One of the most exciting discoveries of the current phase of conservation is the 2 depictions of the goddess Amentet, or Imentet, known as She of the West, and linked with the journey to the afterlife. The West here may be a geographical label. She may have originated in Libya, but it is primarily a mythological, supernatural reference, the West being where the dead travel to reach the underworld. One of the 2 paintings is on the base or trough of the coffin, and the other is inside on the base of that same piece. The best preserved of these 2 paintings is the interior base of the coffin. It shows Amentet in profile, looking right and wearing her typical red dress. Her arms are slightly outstretched. She stands on a platform, indicating the depiction is of a holy statue or processional figure. There are at least 2 other Akhmin coffins known with depictions of Amentet. The last few slides have hinted at the kinds of work the current phase of conservation and interpretation has been focusing on, and I want to pause briefly to set that in context with this slide, which outlines our key conservation objectives produced with the guidance of conservators Helena and Richard Jeschke and Will Murray. And I'll just give you a minute to read these for yourselves before we go on and look at some aspects of this work. we have seen how the current phase of conservation has revealed more of the hieroglyphic inscription. With respect to the removal of the river silts and how best to stabilize the areas of the cartonnage that were lifting away, the cleaning of these elements was achieved with fine-bladed scalpels and swabbing with solutions of 50-50 acetone and water, and the cartonnage was then stabilized with what's known as paraloid 572 in acetone. The most sensitive and time-consuming element of the work was around the consolidation and stabilization of the mummy body. We had long feared that the body was stuck fast to the coffin base, but careful manipulation by Richard Jessica established that it was more loosely packed in with debris and vegetation. This meant the whole could be turned and the coffin lifted off the body, leaving it face down and ready for inspection of the areas of cavity damage in the chest and abdomen. These were carefully emptied, and after stabilization, all loose bone material was reinterred in discrete Tyvek packages. Any voids were filled with inert padding for stability, and the openings closed over with linen. An inert support board was cut to fit the back, and the whole turned over in reverse of the initial procedure. The detached feet were re-added with support to hold them in place. The outer shroud appears to have only loosely covered the front of the body and implies that the body was re-wrapped and reburied. Probably a case of the ancient priests doing their duty of care for the dead and recoffining a body that had been violently pulled from a coffin and abandoned after the removal of amulets. The body then may not be the person named in the hieroglyphic inscription. That's an area we will want to look further at. And I think it's fair to say that we kind of felt like latter-day Egyptian priests in the care we were giving to this body. As part of the imaging of the mummy, samples taken allowed the identification of adipocere, beeswax, and a still to be identified resin. Throughout phase 2, we were careful to collect a large databank of samples from the sarcophagus exterior and interior, from damaged pieces of coffin, and from the body and its coverings. A sample of the soil adhering to the coffin lid was sent to Peter Davidson, Senior Curator of Minerals at the National Museum of Scotland in Edinburgh, whose microscopic examination identified it as river-borne fine sand or silt sediment, confirming the suggestion that it was deposited during a flooding episode, perhaps more than one such episode. In the body cavities, in the linen wrappings, and in the sarcophagus silt deposits were found many insect exoskeletons, which Mark Simmons, our colleague at Perth Museum, identified as smooth spider beetle and hide beetle. Spider beetles are mostly encountered in warm climates, and like the hide beetles, feed on woolens, leather, and tallow, and are sometimes associated with dead animals. Packed around the body and pushed into the cavities, the debris included large amounts of straw, and numerous grains had been taken for identification. Discussion with Dr. Dan Potter of NMS suggested that this material could have been a basic restoration treatment to keep the bodies loose and damaged bones together and to give protection during transport. It awaits confirmation, but we suspect the straw packing is 19th century rather than ancient. The conservation and display of the mummy was precipitated by the long recognised need for such conservation to enable its care, interpretation, and access, and by the project development of a new museum for Perth, occupying the former City Hall building in the city centre. This provides a great opportunity to restore the mummy to regular public access. We opted to maximise public engagement by making the conservation treatment an opportunity to share with visitors what we were doing, making it the heart of an exhibition about collections conservation. We constructed a conservation studio within a gallery, enabled all-round visibility for visitors whilst maintaining physical security and respect for the remains. This included keeping the human remains covered when they were not undergoing assessment or treatment. Visitors were encouraged to talk to the conservators and curators whenever they were busy in the lab. A key aspect of our seeking to involve visitors in what we were doing was the provision of a blackboard on which we could record updates and visitors could chalk questions if no one was in the lab area. And we also ran a visitors' comment book, which evidences strong support for the exhibition. One visitor wrote on the blackboard, "How do you feel about being constantly observed?" To which Helena replied, "We don't mind at all." Working in a team, the public aspect soon faded into the background as we focused on our work and talked amongst ourselves. A very challenging part of the treatment, turning the coffin over, was carried out on a closed day. This was filmed, however, as well as other treatment aspects, and the resulting film was shown in the gallery when there was no conservation activity happening. Unfortunately, the project was curtailed by the COVID-19 lockdown and we had to close early. The pandemic has also precipitated a delay in the implementation of the new museum project. So, in conclusion, we can summarise the discoveries so far as telling us that the coffin was made for a female mummy called Takhareb. It dates to the 25th or 26th dynasty of ancient Egypt, that is 760 to 525 BC, making it approximately 2,500 years old. The sarcophagus was probably made in Akhmin on the Upper Nile. The mummy died at the age of 30 to 35 years and exhibits heavy tooth decay and tooth loss due to gum disease. The mummy's bones have been badly damaged, possibly by grave robbers in antiquity. The mummy was given a remedial recovering and replaced in its original, or possibly a new coffin. The mummy's sex and identity remain uncertain. Is it Takhareb or a later incumbent reburied by the priests? And at this point, I'd just like to say a big thank you to all the colleagues who made this extended project possible. The transportation teams, the radiography teams, and the Manchester Egyptologists, especially Lydia McKnight, Judith Adams, Campbell Price, and Robert Loynes. Also colleagues at NMS, including Dan Potter, the conservation team of Will Murray, and Helena and Richard Jessica, and our Glasgow University volunteer, Catherine Johnson. Finally, there is still work to do, both in terms of samples analysis, in completing the fundraising for what has been done so far, and in terms of finalising the displays for the new museum project, which we hope will also include a facial reconstruction of Takhareb. Here is the link for donations. Please give if you can, and please share the link around. And thank you for your support. And thank you for listening.